The morning of the announcement started like any other at Buckingham Palace. The staff moved through the grand corridors quietly, adjusting curtains and preparing breakfast trays. The corgis padded across the marble floors, and the guards outside stood perfectly still in the cold February air. From the outside, everything looked the same, but inside, something had shifted. A weight had settled over the palace, the kind that comes before a storm, before something changes forever. King Charles III had not slept well. He had been sitting in his private study for hours before dawn, staring at a document on the desk in front of him. His reading glasses sat on the edge of the paper, slightly crooked. A half-empty cup of tea had gone cold beside him. The fire in the hearth was low, reduced to glowing embers, and the only real light in the room came from the green-shaded lamp on his desk. He looked older that morning than he had in weeks. His hands, slightly trembling, rested flat on the paper. He had read it more times than he could count. He knew every word, and yet he kept reading it again. The document in front of him was not a state matter, not a letter from Parliament, not a foreign dignitary's correspondence. It was a medical report, the latest one, delivered the previous evening by the royal physicians. It concerned Camilla, his wife, the queen consort, the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scrutiny, pain, public hatred, and eventually public acceptance. The woman the British people had once despised was now, through years of quiet dignity and steady presence, someone many had come to respect. And now this. But Charles pressed his fingers together and bowed his head. He had made errors in his life. He knew that better than anyone. He had spoken carelessly in moments that cost him dearly. He had allowed the pressure of duty to damage his first marriage. He had let years pass where he and Camilla had to love each other in secret, in shadow, while the world watched and judged. He had been a man who meant well, but sometimes acted without the wisdom the moment required. But this, keeping quiet about Camilla's health until now, felt like the greatest error of all. The story that would break across the world that morning did not begin in the palace study. It began years earlier in quiet doctors' offices, in discreet conversations between trusted physicians, and in the moments Camilla had laughed off a bad scan result and called herself dramatic for worrying. She had always been that way. Practical, self-deprecating, not one for fuss. When the first signs had appeared, she had pushed through them. She told herself it was tiredness, age, the relentless pace of royal life. When the symptoms became harder to ignore, she had asked the doctors to be quiet about it. She did not want the public to see her differently. She did not want to become someone to be pitied. Charles had honored her wish for privacy. That was the part that haunted him now. He had respected her desire to keep things contained, to move through her duties without sympathy, trailing behind her like a shadow. He had watched her stand beside him at ceremony after ceremony, attend charity events, host state dinners, smile for photographs, and make small talk with world leaders, all while carrying something the public could not see. He had watched her do all of this and said nothing. And now the news could no longer be contained. Now it had to come out. What the medical report confirmed was something Charles had been dreading for months. Camilla's condition, which had first been flagged quietly 2 years ago, had progressed. The treatment she had been receiving had slowed things down, but the most recent scans told a story the doctors could no longer soften. The Royal Medical Team had been careful in their language, precise and clinical, but Charles had understood every word perfectly. He did not need the specialists to translate for him. He had read enough, asked enough questions over the past 2 years to know exactly what the results meant. He sat with that knowledge alone for a long time before calling anyone in. When his private secretary arrived at 6:30 that morning, he found the king standing by the window looking out at the palace gardens. The frost was still on the grass. The sky was pale and gray, the kind of flat February light that feels like the world is holding its breath. Charles did not turn around immediately. He stood there for a moment longer, as if storing something away, a last ordinary moment before the rest of the day began. Then he turned, and his secretary saw it in his face before a word was spoken. The press team was called. The communications director arrived. The senior household staff were gathered. Calls were made to senior members of the royal family. The machinery of the monarchy, that vast, quiet, efficient system of people whose entire job was to manage the image and affairs of the crown, began to move. The decision to make a public statement had not come easily. Charles had gone back and forth on it for weeks. There were those in his inner circle who urged transparency, who argued that the public deserved to know, that honesty would be met with compassion rather than criticism. There were others who counseled caution, who worried about the optics, who calculated what a health disclosure might do to public confidence in the monarchy at a time when it was still rebuilding from years of fracture. And there was Camilla herself, who had finally, quietly, given her consent the previous week. She had taken his hand, looked at him steadily, and said that she was tired of carrying it in private. That had made the decision for him. Then the announcement was released at 10 o'clock in the morning through the official royal communications channels. It was written carefully with the kind of language that was warm but not dramatic, honest but not alarmist. It confirmed that Queen Consort Camilla had been receiving treatment for a serious health condition for the past 2 years. It said that her condition had progressed and that her treatment plan was being adjusted by her medical team. It asked for privacy for the family during this time. It thanked the public for their continued support. By 10 minutes past 10, the news was everywhere. In London, people on their morning commute stopped scrolling their phones and stared at the headlines. On television, the rolling news channels broke away from their regular programming. In newspaper offices, editors made rapid calls. It reshaped front pages, pulled obituaries, not because they were needed yet, but because that is what you do quietly, behind closed doors, when news like this arrives. Around the world, the wire services picked it up. The British royal family's story had always traveled far, and this was no exception. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Messages flooded the official palace accounts. Ordinary people who had once held strong opinions about Camilla, who had been teenagers when Princess Diana died and had grown up thinking of Camilla as the villain of that story, found themselves feeling something unexpected. Empathy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the face of someone else's pain. The woman they had once seen as a homewrecker was now a wife, a stepmother, a grandmother, a patient. Or she was someone's person. And King Charles, for all his stiffness and formality, was clearly someone who loved her deeply. What came out in the days following the announcement was the fuller picture, not through official statements, but through the slow accumulation of details that reporters and royal correspondents began to piece together. The 2 years of quiet treatment, the way Camilla had continued her public duties without complaint, the number of events she had attended while managing side effects that would have stopped most people in their tracks, the way Charles had restructured his own schedule around her treatment appointments without ever publicly explaining why. The small, human story behind the official one. There was one detail reported by a journalist with close palace sources, and that lodged itself in the public imagination more than any other. It was said that in the early days of the diagnosis, when it had first become clear this was serious, Camilla had asked Charles not to tell anyone, not because she was in denial, but because she had already spent decades being looked at, talked about, reduced to a role in someone else's narrative. She had been the other woman, the reason for the divorce, the reason for the tragedy. For once, she wanted to just be a person going through something hard without the world watching. Charles had understood. He had held the secret carefully. He had stood beside her in public, smiled for cameras, attended the events, signed the papers, shaken the hands, and carried the knowledge of her condition inside him like a stone. But keeping that secret had cost him. Those who knew him well said he had aged visibly over the previous year. He had been shorter in meetings, slower to smile. There had been moments of unusual sharpness in public, quick, uncharacteristic impatience that people had noticed but not understood. He was not a man who wore his emotions easily. He had been trained since childhood to contain, to perform, to present the face the moment required. But there is only so much a person can hold before something starts to show. After the announcement, Charles was seen leaving the palace briefly in the early afternoon. He was not on official business. He was not visiting a charity or attending a function. He simply walked, with 2 protection officers at a discreet distance, through a section of the palace gardens. Photographs were taken by a photographer who happened to be in position for another purpose. In the photos, Charles walks with his hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed, the familiar posture. But his face is different. It is quiet in a way that is not the same as controlled. He looks like a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time and is not quite sure yet how to stand without the weight. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived at the palace in numbers that surprised even the experienced staff. Many were from people who had lost a partner to illness, or were caring for one, or who had been through serious illness themselves. They wrote about fear and love and the particular loneliness of watching someone you love suffer while the world goes on around you. And they wrote about Camilla with unexpected warmth. A woman who had once been one of the most disliked figures in Britain was receiving handwritten letters from strangers who wanted her to know they were thinking of her. The monarchy had weathered extraordinary storms. It had survived abdication, scandal, tragedy, and the long, painful reckoning that came after Diana's death. It had been shaken by the departures and the interviews, and the accusations and the silences. It had bent in ways that it had never bent before, and yet it had remained, not unchanged, but standing. What this moment revealed, in a way that no official ceremony or jubilee or coronation could manufacture, was something genuinely human at the center of it. King Charles had made errors. He would have been the first to admit that, and he had spent much of his public life being misunderstood, misjudged, underestimated, and sometimes, honestly, he had earned the criticism. But the decision to finally speak, to open the carefully maintained privacy around his wife's illness and let the public see something true, was not read as weakness. It was read as love, as honesty, as the act of a man who had finally stopped calculating and simply told the truth. Camilla, for her part, was seen briefly a few days after the announcement, arriving at a private appointment in London. She wore a pale blue coat and carried her bag over one arm. She did not stop for photographs, but she glanced toward the small group of photographers gathered near the entrance, and she gave them a brief, tired, real smile, not the performed smile of a royal duty, and just the smile of a woman who was still here, still present, still herself. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that people remember. The months ahead would be uncertain. The treatment was ongoing. The palace had not given a prognosis, and the medical team continued to work closely with her. Charles kept his engagements, but adjusted them where he could, staying closer, keeping the schedule lighter on days when she was not well. The world watched, as it always had, but now it watched with something softer in its attention. The greatest error, as Charles himself would later reflect in a private address to close staff, was not the secret itself. It was the belief that keeping it had protected her. In the end, it had only made the burden heavier for both of them. The truth, when it finally came, it had not destroyed anything. It had, in its own painful way, brought something back. A reminder that behind the crowns and the titles and the ceremonies, there were 2 people. Aging, tired, loving, afraid, doing what all people do when the stakes become unbearable, holding on, telling the truth, hoping it was not too late.